So I was having a conversation recently with a Christian, with an evangelical Christian, as is often the case. Somebody who's a little bit older, not like old, but maybe like older Gen X, something like that. But the comment that I got, because we had been having a disagreement over things like orthodoxy and the nature of God and etc. And so we were exchanging ideas, and the comment that I got was, "Well, what is it that you think that you know because you have, an education in theology or whatever? What is it that you think that we know now that we didn't always know? Why is it that you reject the traditional orthodoxy that has been handed down for many generations, um, just because you've thought about it and studied it or whatever in your young age?" Something along those lines. Basically, questioning the validity of a person in our modern day who gets an education, who studies this stuff. How can they know better than the many generations that have come before them? And, it's one of those things where, I was even raised on this idea that uh, it would be foolish to think that we know better now than anybody has ever known. Maybe we know things more in terms of scientific advancements or technology, but we can't know more. We don't know more than them in terms of theology or religious things, things that are philosophical. People have always been sophisticated, and so it would be foolish to think that we can know better than they did. Well, I would honestly just have to disagree with this. I think that we know a lot more, or at least significantly more, than people have ever known over history. And there are a couple of aspects to this. Absolutely, science is a part of this, because science does inform our understanding of theology or religion, and philosophy. I mean, you have people like Aristotle and Aquinas and others who had a particular idea of metaphysics and what the reality of nature was or is. And we know better than that now because physics has told us more about the natural world. And so we don't know everything about the reality of nature. We don't understand metaphysics entirely, but we have, I would say, a more accurate understanding of a metaphysical world now because we just have more information, significantly more information. So that science informs that. I think another aspect of it, though, is history. The more time that passes, the more humanity experiences. And so there's a depth, but also a breadth in that sense, meaning the depth of history, because we've experienced more and more over time, we've been able to learn more and more from our mistakes. We know what works and we know what doesn't. We know what ideas have actually been helpful and what ideas are not. But there's also a breadth of history, because as history goes on and as we grow to understand more about more of the world, we're more connected with the rest of the world. We actually can understand more about different cultures and different ideas and other experiences. And so that informs us as to what we know about not just the history of humanity in different areas, but also what humans have believed in different areas. So that is to say, maybe 2,000 years ago, people, let's say specifically in the Near East, ancient Near East, they thought they had a pretty good idea of the nature of reality or metaphysics. And they thought they had a pretty good idea of what was divine or beyond this physical world. But now we have much more input from the world around us, not just in terms of science and the physical world, and therefore our understanding of the nature of reality, but also we have a greater understanding of the history of many cultures, like Eastern Asian culture, South American culture. There are several continents that were largely unknown to a people in one particular area in the world a couple thousand years ago, because there wasn't that sort of connectedness. But since we have that now, we have so much more input, and we have so many more perspectives to draw from in understanding what the world is like or how we perceive the world. So when you ask the question, well, what is it that you think you know now that, specifically our Christian ancestors have always known and passed down over time, our Orthodox beliefs? Well, we know a lot more than they did, really. And so we have to take the information that we have and use that to update our understanding of our own lives and the reality of everything around us. So it's not enough to just take some tradition and allow it to be your sole standard of truth. Truth, and I've talked more about this elsewhere, but truth it's pretty tricky to discover, and it requires so much more investigation and not just taking what has been passed down to us. Part of this conversation I was having, we were talking about, why wouldn't you just take what you know to be true, and why wouldn't you just focus on that and study that for the long term? And my response was, well, who has more wisdom and who knows more truth? Is it the person who, let's take an example, is it the Christian who only knows their Christian values and only studies their Christian beliefs for 100 years? Or is it the person who studies Christian ideas, atheist ideas, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, Baha'i, all these ideas for 50 years? And you might say, well, the older person who has more time in this world has a greater grasp of truth. But then I think there's a counter argument to say, no, the person who has the greater breadth of experience and understanding, that person might have access to more truth. And so that's a discussion that you'd have to get into. But the point being is, it's not simple enough to say we're so young and people who are living now are too young to be able to know more or better than anybody that has ever lived. We can't just take what's passed down to us. Our experiences are constantly updating. We are gaining new information, and that does give us more information and more accurate information about truth as we move forward. Not always, but overall, that I think that's true. I think that's what happens, is we actually gain more over time. Bare minimum, you can't just rebuff it and say, just because we are, any human being that is alive today is so much younger than the history of humanity. Just because that's the case doesn't mean that they don't have a better grasp of truth. I do think that, a 19-year-old kid today has a better grasp of truth than, maybe a 50-year-old man or woman who lived 2,000 years ago. In a certain way, of course. There's wisdom and there's knowledge, and so that's a whole conversation you can get into. But it's not okay. It's not valid to simply say that we can't know more now than we always have before. Now, just a quick final thought on this is where this often comes into play, I think. For someone with my experience and my study, is this comes into play with how we read the Bible and interpret it. And so many people, at least in certain Christian cultures, they will interpret things in the Bible the way that they have been interpreted for centuries. But when we stop and we double back on that, we take a second look at it and we say, wait a second, let's see if this is valid. We realize there's a new way to understand this, which in fact might be more accurate because of what we know. And so we don't want to just take what some people, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago said about it just because they had some ideas and they said some things about it and passed it on. We don't want to just take that and run with it. We want to do better by taking another look, comparing it to what we know now, and updating it and progressing beyond that.